accueillir Mark Partridge. Mark is American and he will talk in English. So Mark is an economist and a regional scientist, and he comes from the Ohio State University, and he works in the Department of Agricultural, Environmental, and Development Economics. He is well known as a specialist of rural and urban economy and rural development and rural policy. The topic of his conference today is about a very important question for us. The question is, do we need place-based or geographically targeted policy for the new rural economy? Mark, the floor is for yours for 40 minutes.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Bertrand. And I want to tell you what a pleasure and what an honor it is to be here today. In particular, I think one of the key elements, the key theme of this conference, and I think of research in France and to perhaps a lesser extent, say in Quebec on rural development, I believe is going to be an important theme of my talk, and that is issues of governance. You have to get the issues of governance correct, or rural policy is going to be ineffective. So that'll be a key theme of what I'll talk about. Now, before I begin, I just want to note that my wife is Italian. In fact, she's a regional scientist, regional economist as well. And she likes to point out that I have a strong American accent, which I consider a compliment. But she says that, okay, but you have to remember, nobody can understand you then. And so I will try to talk. I'll try to speak slowly, much slower than I'm accustomed to, because I talk way too fast. So given that, thank you again. Let me motivate what I'm going to talk about is that a lot of people poo-poo regional research, especially among economists. Economists, oh, it's not important, especially macroeconomists. This isn't very important. And people who do regional and urban economics and regional science argue this is very important. In a globalizing world where factors could move at the touch of a button, capital, workers, entrepreneurs, knowledge workers, regional policy takes on even more importance than ever before, because small gaps of competitiveness, if one region is just slightly more competitive than another region, now resources can move throughout the world to this place. The effects are magnified. Winners especially win in a global economy. Losers especially lose in this global economy, and thus getting it right matters more than ever. And so this is something that I've argued in my presidential address I once gave in an association. Is these kinds of regional policies is where it's at. It's getting it right at the regional level, because if you don't get it right, you're a big loser. So it matters more than ever in this global economy. So then the question is what kinds of policies should we do? And do place-based policies, that as Bertrand noted, are geographically targeted policies, are they really effective? And I'm going to in the end argue they can be effective, but we have to be careful. But because they too often can divert resources from productive activities to unproductive activities. So getting it right with place-based policy will be a key theme of what I want to talk about. But I think in terms of rural development, where a lot of my research has been stressed, say especially since for about 2004, I've noted a major problem. This goes back, for decades, across Europe and in North America and in Japan and so on. The media and politicians and too many academics often look at the landscape and associate the landscape with what the people are actually doing. If they see an agricultural landscape, they assume that everybody must be farmers, and the whole economy is tied to farming. Or if they see a forest landscape, they assume that everybody must be engaged in forestry, and so on. And that view is often backwards looking. It often is the way the world was in 1950, but the world has greatly evolved since 1950, and we need to be looking at policy to be forward-looking. Where will the world be in 2032, not how it was back in 1950? And then obviously, this is well known in this audience, we've had incredible labor-saving technological change in the primary sector and agriculture. Very few farmers grow much more food than what was ever grown back in the 20th century. And what's replaced the primary sector in rural areas is a much more diverse economy. People commuting in the city, some people work in the primary sector, tourism, very, very diverse economy, yet policy is too often focused on the world of 1950, looking at sectors that were very strong in 1950 and still diverting resources there instead of the reality of this broad, diverse rural economy and rural development that actually exists today. So what I'm going to argue in one sense, in one dimension, I will make a point that we need more regional policy, that there's too much blurring of urban and rural. And that's a wonderful paper that Frederick Wallet and Andre Torre wrote describing this blurring of rural and urban. And, everything from how agricultural systems have developed with local foods to governance arrangements to commuting activities. And if rural and urban share this joint interdependence, we need policies to reflect the fact that rural and urban are very interdependent. Currently, most policies, we have a rural policy and we have an urban policy, but not really a regional policy that recognizes the interdependence between the two. And in that, one of the elements of good policy is that, of course, every place is different. One size doesn't fit all. Governance needs to reflect the realities of every country. Here in France, we have a very centralized kind of government coming from the central government on down. If we were in Germany, where we have a more federal system, different kinds of governance needs to reflect it. That's one dimension of where the governance arrangements need to be different across countries. So why do we need to? We can argue, and I'll describe some of the arguments against rural policy. Arguments that you would hear, say, at the World Bank, arguments you'd hear at, say, academic places like Harvard and the London School of Economics, and I'll talk about that. But regardless of what they say, rural policy is going to always remain important, and it's going to be important to get it right, because a disproportionate share of poor regions tend to be rural or peripheral, and they're going to receive, say, EU cohesion funds and what have you, and there's a high share of expenditures going to rural sectors. So getting rural policy is important because a lot of money is spent there. We could talk about an urbanizing world, yet a disproportionate share of resources go to rural areas. We need good policies to reflect that. However, I will, as I've already indicated, note that policies too often around the world in developed countries reflective of the 1950s world, not reflective of today's world. So I'm going to focus on the USA. In that sense, a lot of my examples will be, but then I'm going to tie it back into EU policy, especially how it relates, say, with the common agricultural policy and in that manner. So that's kind of the introduction of what I'll talk about. First, let me give a little bit of policy typology so that when I use words, you have a good understanding what I mean by these words. You may have a different meaning yourself, but at least how I'm using them in terms of this talk. One is development. And I'm going to take a standard economics point of view. What is development? And we always look at people maximizing utility. They're maximizing satisfaction. People want to be happy. And they're going to pick up and move to places where they're going to be the most satisfied. People can move. If they don't like a place, they'll move to another place. And so satisfaction is economic conditions. Satisfaction is amenities such as the natural environment and the landscape and the climate. Very important. Quality of life considerations, which of course government services play an important role. People are looking at all this combination and they're making trade-offs. Where are they want to be, where they want to get the most satisfaction. And in that, I believe that economics is the most important element in this one context only. And that is, we have to have a minimal level of economic opportunity or we'll turn the place into a nature preserve. So rural areas will be a nature preserve if we don't have some minimal level of economic opportunity. So economics plays that. We have to get at least over the threshold before we can start talking about amenities and quality of life playing a role. So given that notion, economists tend to look at, especially in North America, we talk about how people trade off economic conditions for amenities and quality of life. In other words, people are willing to accept less income if they have a high quality of life. If they have amenities, if they have a nice environment, they're willing to trade off lower economic income to get better quality of life. So in the US, it's weather. Americans hate snow. So we move to warm places. That's the way it's been for about 60 years. In the European Union, people trade off more on culture and family in that sense. In China, it's almost entirely economic. very little consideration of environmental conditions. However, given that diversity of people's views and preferences, policy should reflect what the people want, not necessarily trying to impose preferences on the people, because the people will rebel and we won't get the outcomes we want. We have to recognize people are different, and ultimately if the people don't get what they want, the policy will be ineffective. So the next policy typology is when Bertrand introduced me is 3 different notions of how policy can be delivered in rural areas. One is people-based policies. We give people skills. We give people training. We give people education. We help them move to where they want to live. Help the people, and the people will then move to where they get the most opportunity. We'll have the most opportunity. This is, as the World Bank called it in 2009, they called these spatially neutral policies. Helping the people, don't worry where they're at, but help the people first. Sectoral policies are policies aimed at sectors, helping agriculture, helping high technology, helping building clusters, and those kinds of development schemes. Those are sectoral-based policies, less aimed, they could be aimed at a place. Rural policy could be delivered through agriculture because agriculture tends to be in rural places, but it's aimed at a sector, not necessarily at the place or the people. And what I'll talk about is place-based policy. Should we target policy for places where people live? In other words, worry a little bit less about what the people have and more about the place where they live in. And that would be the territorial or geographically targeted policies. And what the entire notion of this conference is some sort of notion that we want some sort of geographical targeting of policy, or there wouldn't be much reason for this conference. So that would be these place-based policies. So let's talk about some of the myths. And this is, I think, well known among many of you, but I'll just go through it. One is, as I've already noted, the myth that the 1950 world still exists. And I would face this if I went and spoke to committees in Washington at Congress. This would be the myth that I'd have to fight against, is that rural areas are only natural resource based. They're not this broad diversity of people doing all sorts of things. So for example, I would point out, using data, say, from 2005 in rural or non-metropolitan America, if you look at the share of income generated from farming and mining and food processing and in manufacturing of petroleum and coal, you get about 6.7% of income. About 1/16 of income would come from these primary sector activities. In metropolitan America, if you add up all of the income generated from finance and real estate, you get about 8.5%. So generally, the way our US Congress looks at rural policy, and even the European Common Agricultural Policy to some extent looks at rural policy, is let's primarily do it through the primary sector. Just focus on that. And what I notice is that would be the equivalent of saying Spain's bank bailout is an urban development policy because it went to bankers. I mean, it's probably not a good urban development policy, yet it would be the equivalent of what's done for rural policy. It's sector-based policy. It's too narrow. It hits too small of a share of the population to have broad-based effective elements. We need more of a policy that hits all parts of the rural economy. This illustrates the point. I have an arrow. This is a more complicated graph that I wish I had, but this is the share. I have the dark blue arrow pointing at the share of the American workforce working in agriculture, and then on the right-hand side is the percent. And what it shows is about 1/3 of Americans worked on farms a century ago. Today, it's about 1%. And then I'll show some European numbers to give this feel, but it's a very different economy. This breaks it down in rural and urban America, and I'll focus on the red line. The red line shows if you have any job, you work 1 hour and you report it on your taxes on a farm. 1 hour, you're counted as farming in this case. The red line shows the share of the workforce in farming in rural America. About 1 out of 7 Americans 40 years ago worked on a farm. Today, it's about 1 in 20. Point is, even in rural America, using the most broadest definition of agriculture, we've had this tremendous labor-saving productivity growth. And on the good side, that means farming is a very successful story. Very few farmers are able to grow more food than ever before, but it means rural development has to be done in a different manner than what it would have been done in the past. This illustrates, I'll quickly go over this. This illustrates up and down the supply chain in agriculture. Productivity growth, fewer people doing more is the story. This on the far right is the non-metropolitan share of the workforce that was supplying inputs to agriculture. It was about 1.2% in 1981. Today it's about 0.4. Productivity growth, this is good. Fewer people doing more at a lower cost, but it means rural development is different than it was. The same thing for food processing. This is manufacturing of food. In 1981, over 6% of the workforce was making food processing. Today, it's under 3% and falling. Again, up and down the supply chain, the same story. It's success. Food is going to cost less money. We can grow more than ever before, but we have to administer rural development very differently because of this. So this shows the geographical scope in the United States. I'll talk here briefly about Europe, but in the United States, this is from the United States Department of Agriculture. If 15% of income was earned from farming, they put green. So most of America in 1950 was dependent upon farming as their primary activity. By 2000, it was just a small slither going down the middle of the country. Very different world. That doesn't mean there's still rural America as most of that map, but what part of it's still dependent upon farming is very different. So we have to have policy that reflects that the world is different. So one next question then is that if agriculture or your base industry is declining, a typical story is you'll hear among regional science, an old story is what we called economic base. You had to have an export sector to be competitive. You have to export things to bring in money. And that's what a mercantilist view of the world. And what I'm trying to show is that's not a very good theory if you look at how rural areas actually develop. In red, it shows, dating back to 1880, the share of the urban population in the United States. And it was about 28%. By 2000, it was about 80% of Americans lived in urban areas. The green is the share of Americans who lived on farms. About 45% of Americans lived on farms in 1880. Today, it's under 1%. The blue is the share of Americans who live in rural areas but not on farms. And that's been constant. It's been about 20%. It's been about 20% since the founding of America. About 20% of Americans constantly over time have lived in rural areas but not on farms. In other words, there's been a decoupling of non-farm rural America from farm rural America, illustrating this diversity. Everybody's doing everything differently. We need policy to reflect that this decoupling's taken place. How can we get it right? How do we get it right with this massive landscape that tends to be agricultural with the fact that the people are doing things that are very different? This illustrates what's happening in the United States. This is the upper middle of the United States. This would be states, if you're familiar, if you could get your little map of the United States, this is the middle of the United States, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska. Those are agricultural states. So what I have is in red is population growth, blue is population loss, places that are losing people. And what this shows is I have a ring of 100 kilometers, about a 1-hour drive to a city of 500,000 people, and 200 kilometers, about a 2-hour drive to a city of 500,000 people. And what you see there is, if I had a pointer, I would show you, what you would see there is places, even in agricultural areas, the growth is taking place near cities, even out to 200 kilometers. Where you don't see the growth is places that are remote. The other places that you have a lot of growth is the red. Those are mountainous areas. They tend to be mountainous, very nice landscape, high amenity places. So where the growth, what we have is really 3 rural Americas in this map. Remote areas that are shrinking, areas near cities that are growing, and then rural areas that are high amenity that people want to live in because they're very nice. These are 3 very different areas, all requiring different policies. And France has a very similar emerging, a little bit less on the amenity side, but emerging over time towards the south of France. You have urban adjacent, peri-urban areas that are growing, and then more remote areas that have had more challenges, very similar kinds of outcomes. This would show a Canada commuting map. I won't describe that, but it just illustrates the how far people commute across North America to cities. So this shows, okay, so what about the European Union? And this is where I could get reasonable data from Eurostat, and Eurostat has inconsistent data across countries. But this is the share of full-time equivalent workers in agriculture across countries I could get consistent data across that. So in particular, the best example is Italy. France, I don't have data going back far enough, but Italy shows a very similar transformation of about almost 1 out of 5 Italians worked on farms in 1970, and today it's about 1 in 20. But across all these European countries, a similar kind of trend taking place, that this labor-saving technological change. Farms are more productive than ever, able to grow more food than ever before, but that means we have a very different rural economy than, say, 50 or 60 years ago. So given these realities, that's the reality. We have to make rural policy based on what's actually happening out there, not the way it once was. What kinds of policies can we do? One is what I call neo-sectoral policies. And that is that a recognition, I argue actually a very important recognition, is that environmental issues play an important role in rural areas. Rural areas are in a sense, the stewards of the environment. That is where most of the land mass is. That's where the watersheds are. Rural areas are the stewards of the environment. And thus, we need an important element of this conference is good environmental policies. But are these necessarily good economic development policies? So I want to talk about, can we turn environmental policy and then claim it's an economic development policy? And I'm going to argue that it's probably not a good idea to mix the two. That we too often they're too important. We need environmental policy, we need economic development policy, but too often when we try to mix the two, we don't get good either. We lose out on both. So let me talk about one example from the United States, and that is green jobs. So President Obama came in and other politicians argued that an excellent rural development policy would be various kinds of alternative energy policies, and this would create scores of jobs in rural America. It would be good for the environment, it would be good for economic development, and we'd be able to get both. And what I'm going to try to show you is that I agree that we need alternative energy, and I agree we need economic development, but mixing the two didn't work very well. So in particular, it shouldn't have been surprising. One of the problems with alternative energy in terms of economic development is that it's very capital intensive. It doesn't take very many people to run wind farms. It doesn't take very many people to do biofuels. In other words, they're very capital intensive. They don't create very many jobs. That's good. That's actually a good thing. It means wind energy doesn't have to cost a lot of money because it doesn't use a lot of workers. It could eventually be competitive, but it isn't going to spur a lot of jobs. So given that, how does that tie into the used notion of multifunctionality? Clearly, a key element of the Common Agricultural Policy is multifunctionality, and it be driven through various kinds of trade agreements and so on. Now, in that, of course, a key element then of rural development is supporting agro-environmental services, cultural policy, heritage, and so on. And all of these are worthwhile policy goals. All of these deserve policies to support that. I think there's enough evidence, especially in the environmental economics field, that people are willing to pay for these policies. Now that isn't what I'm worried about. What I'm more worried about, do they then in turn support economic development, create jobs? That would be where I'm concerned about. So they're worthwhile goals, but do they create enough jobs? If they don't create very many jobs, then we need another economic development policy, perhaps focused on small and medium enterprises and so on, that would actually then create the economic development. So again, it's not that these alternative ideas, like the points of these conferences, is necessarily bad. In fact, they're very important. They just don't tie in. We just can't just mix them all together and think we're going to create economic development and a clean environment and cultural heritage and all at once. So the point is good intentions is not necessarily good policy. Let me show you an example of this from the United States. In the United States, and the United States was, I think, rightfully criticized for this policy, subsidized ethanol production from corn. Heavy, heavy subsidies for ethanol production for corn. In a sense, we were criticized for that because of it raised food prices and so on. It was certainly effective at raising corn prices, which is what the corn farmers wanted. This shows where the peak of this ethanol boom in the United States took place. That's the states of Minnesota and Iowa. That's our corn belt. That's where we grow corn. Some of the most productive parts for growing corn in the world. And those red dots are where all the ethanol plants are. So that's where we had all the ethanol plants. They built all these ethanol plants in that part of the world. Right there in Minnesota and Iowa is where it's centered. Another element about that is this shows where all the wind farms are in the United States. And another part of that, Minnesota, Iowa, it's very, very windy. It's not a very nice place. It's humid and hot in the summer, so you grow corn, and it's windy all the time, and it's cold in the winter. But it's great for wind farms. So this place has all these ethanol plants and has all these wind farms. So this would be a great place if President Obama or other policies to promote green jobs actually helped areas. It would work in this part of the world because it has all the wind farms and all the biofuel plants. This shows, well, what actually happened. And I picked the peak year of the ethanol boom, though I could have picked any other year. This is a map of where people actually moved. So if this policy was effective, people would have been moving there to take all the jobs that were being created. Rather, what we observe is yellow is population loss, and blue and red is population gain. And I put a circle where all the wind farms and ethanol plants are, and people were leaving. People were leaving that area. Not that there were, the reason why is they were such a small number of people were being employed, it didn't have any impact on the economy. So that doesn't mean, again, the United States definitely needs alternative energy, but don't think it's going to create a lot of jobs because the evidence was it wasn't creating a lot of jobs. So we need environmental policy, but then we need to think that the economic development policy needs to be decoupled so that we can get both right instead of mixing the two. So the implications are of all of this is that rural economies have fundamentally changed, and that one of them is rural-urban interdependence. And this is where the point of this conference is so important, where there's spillovers, where rural affects urban and urban affects rural and so on. We need, economists talk about internalizing that. The word is we need governance arrangements which reflects the fact that everybody's affecting one another. We need governance to take that into account so that one part isn't doing a bad policy versus the other part. And so that is one of the, I think, the key element of this conference has been, and I think in French rural research has been a key element, is just trying to find promoting better governance arrangements. And certainly some of these have failed and some of them are successful. Some of these kinds of experimental approaches that discussed here at this conference, but it becomes the important thing. If that's the way rural areas are, we have to have better governance to effectively do policy. So what is good policy? What is a good strategy? The World Bank basically said place-based policy was ineffective. They backed off a little bit. But their 2009 World Development Report basically argued that resources should flow to cities because cities are more productive, and by taking resources away from cities to rural areas, we're moving funds from productive areas to unproductive areas, which reduces economic activity. They were arguing that that's bad for economic development. Concentrate on cities, forget about rural and peripheral areas. That was what the World Bank argued in 2009. That's an argument that many economists had made. Like I noted, Ed Glazer's a famous economist at Harvard. You could go to the London School of Economics and get a similar viewpoint that these place-targeted policies are completely ineffective. They're a waste of resources and shouldn't be done. And they have points. They didn't make this up. They have points. Politicians too often use the money to support elite and favored sectors, not using the money to support the actual people. That would be one argument. They argue that it slows adjustments from declining to expanding regions. Okay, they have points. Now, the World Bank received a lot of pushback on that approach. Andres Rodriguez Pose, who might be familiar to many of you, who's also at London School of Economics, argued very effectively that they were too simplistic. The Barca report for the European cohesion policy also argued that the World Bank went way too far out. OECD has argued that the World Bank went too far in its statements of only supporting urban areas. A lot of my point would be a lot of what they said was correlation, that cities are correlated with growth, but not necessarily in all cases the causes of the growth. Another argument that I think is important is people who argue against, economists who argue against place-based policy, targeted policy, will talk about sorting. It's a word that we use, sorting. People sort. They choose to live where they want to live. And they argue that one of the reasons why peripheral and rural areas lag is people who choose to live in rural and lagging regions lack the skills and the inclination to work. In other words, people who don't want to work choose to live in rural and peripheral areas, and no policy could help that area because they have a large share of the workforce who doesn't really want to work or work hard. And so that would be their argument against place-based policy, that people don't want to work there, why throw money at those regions? And another argument against the policy is that, especially in North America, but even in Europe, that even if you could somehow get successful, you help a place and it's growing, new people would move there and take all the jobs, and the original residents wouldn't benefit. So why do the policy, is their argument. Well, in some work I did with one of my co-authors, Stan Rickman, we were looking at poverty, and we were looking at remote regions. We argued that a necessary and sufficient condition to do place-based policy is that lower-income people, lower-income households, and some of the population doesn't pick up and move. They don't move the way these economists describe. They don't pick up automatically and pick up and move to Paris if there's more activity there. So if that's the case, if just enough of the population is immobile or less likely to move, then place-based policy will work. So that was our argument. I said, okay, if that's the case, place-based policy can work. Doesn't mean it will work, but it can work. And what we found is that if policy would have been ineffective, you create jobs in a rural area or remote area, and poverty rates don't fall, unemployment doesn't fall, and all you did is brought in a bunch of migrants, then that would be an argument against place-based policy. You didn't help the people who needed the help, you helped other people. And we found that in remote and high poverty areas, that economic creation, job creation, actually reduced poverty more in those places. It actually reduced unemployment rates more in those places. That place-based policy was particularly effective in lagging areas. In other words, if those other economists were right, these lazy people wouldn't have taken jobs. We found that's wrong. No, they would take jobs if there's economic opportunity. That sorting argument's overstated. That place-based policy can work. And in Europe, so taking that argument then to Europe, where mobility rates are lower, migration rates in France are probably about 1/4 of what they are in the United States. People are less likely to move. Lower mobility rates mean that place-based policy would be even more effective in France than what it would be in the United States, and I think I've shown that potentially it could be effective in the United States. I think that's an important argument, is that lower mobility rates means it's going to be more effective. So what does this mean? Well, one is that, okay, place-based policy can work. The kinds of policies we're talking about at this conference can work. But we have to realize that it has shortcomings. We have to realize that one is that I've already indicated countries are different. France has a different federal, central government, local government structure than Germany or the United States or Canada and so on. The other one is that each area is different. In France, we have high amenity areas that need different policy than peri-urban areas that are more rural in nature than remote areas. We have to recognize that in terms of our policy. One of the things that I found in my research is that small and medium enterprise development is very effective in some settings, but not very effective in other settings. And so in that sense, trying to apply small and medium enterprise development would be foolish to do across the board because it won't work in large numbers of places. So realizing that places are different, and they even could be different in unexpected ways, is important. And I think that's something that economists can learn from geographers. Us economists like to look at statistical analysis, and we tend to pull averages. This is an average effect that we can then generalize across the country or a region. And geographers point out they're less interested in these average effects and they're more interested in heterogeneity. And I think that that's something that economists in terms of policy can learn, that heterogeneity means policy has to be delivered differently in places. And that, well, if we have good strategy, we have to get governance correct. We have to get the governance correct. And that is, how do we get governance that reflects spillovers across rural and urban areas versus remote areas? We need better policy innovations to ensure that rural and urban areas share in revenues, they share in better planning and management. We want good planning to protect the rural environment, but we don't want too much planning to turn it into a museum that economic development can't take place and there's too few jobs. We need to get that mix right. We need good management, we need good infrastructure development, not too much infrastructure, because infrastructure could actually drain resources from rural areas because they can come to rural, but they can also leave rural, but get it right. And a key issue then which is a key element of research at this conference among French rural development, and as I noted in Quebec rural development, is social capital. How do we use social capital to get good governance arrangements? How do we use social networks? One of the problems with social capital is that social capital is this bonding force, a potential bonding force of trust and relationships that's the glue, and it's also the grease that gets economies and regions more productive. But also it could be negative. As sociologists point out, social capital can promote an elite network of elites that only they benefit at the expense of the general population. How do we get good governance then that uses the social capital to promote more input across all stakeholders, just narrowly across a few? So that's a key element in governance reform, is how do we get all participation so that we just don't help a handful of elites, we get input from everybody. Then, as Torre and Wallet pointed out, a key element of getting governance is differences between geographical and organized proximity. Is that there's differences between places that are just nearby that are actually organized to actually function. And how do we bridge these differences in getting more cooperation against regions? And then a related question, and this is actually work that Bertrand was very influential in my thinking, is growth center or growth pole approaches. That was an approach especially tried here in France in the 1970s, with at best mixed results. And those, especially growth pole approaches, had a lot of limited effectiveness. Now, I think one of the reasons in my research, and I think Bertrand's research from France, say from around 2000, would support that, one of the reasons why these growth pole approaches were not particularly effective is they were done too early. In other words, they were done right at the peak as rural areas were sending farm labor to cities, and not done today when we can now have more commuting and longer-term relationships, different kinds of relationships. So in that sense, should that be a policy we go back to? And in the sense that I noted Bertrand's research for France and some of the work I've done for Canada and some work that's been done in the United States has shown that in today's environment, urban growth can spread out and create opportunities in rural areas. This is an area, do we want to go back to that? There's reasons to think that possibly could work. The real constraint against that policy is actually buying trust. Rural areas are always very skeptical of urban-led growth. Is this another trick of urban areas of trying to steal resources? So in that sense, this is an area that when we start getting governance right, can we do real economic development as a region instead of splitting rural and urban into two separate areas? And of course, that leads to some other questions. And in North America, we've argued that policy should not be administered through sectors. It's too often done to support political supporters. In the United States, one of the criticisms of rural policy has been done to support large farms, not necessarily the broader rural population. So this leads to a question. In North America, we asked, should policy be conducted by agricultural ministries? In the sense that this is something, and if it is conducted in an agricultural ministry, how can we do it right? So in the sense that agricultural ministry, this is the conflict of interest an agricultural ministry faces with rural development. The conflict of interest is they're set up primarily, this is the reason why we have an agricultural ministry, is to support food in the farm sector. And to have a strong competitive farm sector, we need competitive farmers, fewer farmers growing more to compete on world markets. So that'd be a successful agriculture ministry. Fewer farmers growing more food that competes on world markets. But that's contradictory of what the rural policy needs, which is people working. So how can we get so within our agriculture ministry, we have this conflict of interest. How do we fight that conflict of interest to good rural policy? And so in that sense, that's something. Can agricultural ministries do that? And it has to fight that conflict of interest. It's internal within it. Good food policy often contradicts good rural development policy for that reason. So we argue, economists like to argue, don't pick winners, treat all sectors alike, and allow the most productive sectors to rise to the top. So last couple points on this is that then what has regional scientists and urban economists pointed out for what regions will succeed? I don't think I'll get much debate. It's the smart regions. Places that are smart, that have a well-educated workforce with knowledge and skills and the climate that facilitates innovation is going to win. But we have to be realistic in rural areas. We're not going to turn rural areas into hubs of innovation. It's going to be very difficult to create peripheral areas into hubs of innovation. But we can increase the kinds of skills they have at the middle of their workforce to allow them to be competitive in things that rural areas can be competitive in. So in that sense, knowledge is important, but we need to be thinking about what is a good knowledge strategy for Paris isn't a good knowledge strategy for rural areas in France. And a key problem of that in any kind of policy is that, and I think that I would receive a lot of support in this, is that government agencies lack the capacity to support, to understand local economies. In other words, they're too often, if these were ministering programs like the EU cohesion policy is around, what, 60 billion euros a year, and yet there's these very small staff that evaluates it and administers it. And the same could be in development policy in France. We have these relatively small staffs administering these large programs, and they're not large enough, and they don't have the capacity to understand all these local regions. And so if we have these very important policies, we have to have the capacity to understand what we're actually doing. And then to resist the urge of politicians to support their political allies, not necessarily the kinds of policies that would be effective. So, given that that's kind of an outline of where we've been, and then what I think what we should be doing, supporting knowledge, supporting better governance, recognizing that we need environmental sustainability from economic sustainability. And I'll just note before I conclude, what I think probably the best approach would be is that policy needs to have a sustainable environment. And I think the best policy would be to set up your environmental policy on the basis of benefits and costs. And if the environmental policy is the most effective, implement the policy. But then once you've implemented the environmental policy, you have that policy in mind, then within that, then start thinking about what kind of economic development policy are we going to need given those kind of environmental policies. So in other words, let the environmental policy go first, but then have the economic policy say, hey, given that we have to have a sustainable environment, how can we best develop given those constraints? Instead of what we currently have, let's try to do the both all together. And what we end up with is bad environmental policy and bad economic development policy, as we're trying to mix the two too much, instead of keeping them separate, where we can actually then think about them more holistically then, I think. So, okay, so given that conclusion is rural policy is too often a misguided mixtures of policies aimed at supporting sectors, very small share of the population that might have been strong in 1950, but not what the people are doing, say, in 2012, not recognizing that rural areas and urban areas have so much in common. But given that, I think I've also made a reasonable case, I think it's numerically, statistically based case that place-based policy can work, but we have to recognize that it too often can be hijacked by politicians to support political interests, not necessarily the people. So we have to resist that. We have to keep it focused on the people. So in that sense, we have to recognize the weaknesses of place-based policy if we're going to actually implement it. If we're going to implement it effectively, recognize that it has some problems so we can implement it better. And then in that, one is that another conclusion I've drawn is that I think reliance less on governments to provide the solution. One is to recognize that in rural areas or any place, we have this incredible amount of knowledge and skills and entrepreneurial talents where the people actually can work. If they're given the right environment, the people can succeed. So if governments can think more about what they do best, and that's providing services and education and infrastructure, and not what governments aren't very good at venture capital operations. They're not very good at setting up industries and firms. They don't do that very well. In other words, let the private sector do what it's good at, and let the government do what it's really good at, and that is providing good public services. I think that would be the most effective way of actually doing it. Let the people empower the people to actually do what's most effective. And in that, getting good government policy is correct. But another element is that joint work I've done has looked at the capacity to implement policy. And one of the things that was disappointing, I think us, especially the social scientists in this audience, we often talk about the best policy. Let's do this. If we just tweak the policy, we can get better outcomes. What's the best policy? And we don't think very much about the government that's actually implementing the policy. And if we give incompetent government good policy, we have an incompetent government trying to implement the best policy, it won't help. It doesn't help at all because they're incompetent. So we need to think more, how can we create government capacity so that it can actually implement policy? Even mediocre policy implemented by a good government will be more effective than good policy implemented by an incompetent government. So we need to think more, I think, as social scientists. How can we empower governments, give them the capacity to actually function? So on that note, and again, the common economists don't pick winners. Let that come up from the people and the businesses where the winners are. Create the climate for the winners to win. Don't necessarily try to pick them. So on that note, I will stop there and take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark, for this very stimulating and a little provocative conference. I think it's time for questions. If you have questions or comments or remarks or suggestions. Okay.
My question is addressing the beginning of your talk. Although at the end you have spoken about sustainability and a necessary holistic view, at the beginning you have you have proposed a definition of development as maximizing utility. So I was wondering whether there are not two dangers with the use of this word. The danger that utility could be understood as utility here. So like if my territory was disconnected from the rest. And the second danger would be considering utility now. So in this case, what about our children?
If I think I understand the question, I think a good example of let's say a policy that's not sustainable is China. That is just clearly not a sustainable policy. It's only focused on economics and only focused on income. The only thing Chinese policy is trying to do is maximize income. They could care almost none about the environment. So when I was describing at the very end, I think the first order importance is before we implement my maximizing utility of residents, we have to do that with the constraint that we have a sustainable environmental policy. So the first thing is making sure that we have a sustainable environmental policy. Then within that constraint that we're going to have a sustainable policy, we can then talk about maximizing utility within that. So, but I think the first step is it has to be sustainable. And for example, I don't see how China can continue to develop the way it is for another decade at the way it's destroying its environment.
Okay, I have just two questions. When you talk about population-based policy or sectorial policy, you claim this kind of policy are spatially neutral. I don't think so. I think we have to take into account of the spatial effect of this kind of policy. How can we take into account of this impact, positive or either negative, of this kind of policy in your framework, and how is possible to evaluate this kind of effect?
Well, I think that's a great question. I was very simplistic when I described people policy and sector policy and place policy in the sense that it's a continuum. If we administer a workforce training program, it better be delivered differently in rural France than it would in Paris. So in other words, they would have to have some place-tailored nature to the policy or it'll be utterly ineffective. So that would be the first element. In terms of a sector policy, that could be it could have very disproportionate place-based effects. In other words, a high technology strategy that's going to support the high technology industry of France is probably only going to have its biggest place-based effects in urban France and probably very little in rural France. Thus, it'll have different spatially different geographical effects. So in that sense, I was trying to argue that the World Bank overstated their case that these were spatially neutral, especially the people-based policies, that it has to have a place-based element to that. How do you evaluate those? Well, first I will talk about sector-based policies. Economists are very, very skeptical in general of sector policies, of supporting, say, the high technology sector, or supporting the agricultural sector, or picking a sector, picking a winner. Economists tend to be very skeptical of those policies because one is they often are delivered not necessarily to who you want, but to politically connected audiences. And economists say that's not the way you should be running a policy to help everybody through helping politically connected. The next problem is policymakers are certainly no better than the private sector, if not worse, at knowing what will be the future winners. And in that sense, I could point out lots of examples of where they picked high technology or advanced technology sectors right when the industry was in decline. And in the last, and I'll get to your evaluation question. The last example would be if we could imagine a policy in 1970 that targeted clusters. They weren't called clusters then, but that's the word we'd use today. Say in 1970, in France, we could have found in northeast France, we could have found the steel cluster. And we could have said, look at this cluster. Why don't we support this steel industry? We could have done the United States. Look at the auto industry in Detroit. Why don't we support this cluster in Detroit? Right when the industry went into collapse. In other words, we would have been wasting resources. We would have picked a cluster right as it went into decline. So too often when politicians pick clusters, it's right at their peak and they're already at the beginning of their decline. So economists tend to be skeptical of those policies in general. In terms of evaluating them, that is really the next frontier of good research. How do we evaluate geographically targeted policy? Because it's extremely challenging. Where do policymakers put target policies? Do they target places that are really struggling? And thus, we're lucky to find that we had, in other words, it looks like the policy failed because they put the resources in struggling places. Or do policymakers have a bias to successful places, and it looks like the policy was successful even though the policy did nothing? So we have this issue of where policy is done and how to evaluate it. Then the next problem is is that how do we know what the counterfactual is? How do we know what the world would have been without the policy? That's really hard. And so in place-based policy, we tend to look at, well, places that are similar. Well, how do we know that they're similar? In other words, that's the real cusp of what do we need? We could talk about my framework of what place-based policy potentially could work, but how do we evaluate it once we're done? And right now, that is really the next challenge. How do we evaluate good geographically targeted policy or find out if it was good?
Okay. Well, Mark, you put the stress on the fact that there are too many local policies and they're very different, either sectoral or territorial and so on. And I do agree on the fact that in the end, so large part of them miss the target. We can see that. So there can be various reasons, of course, and you highlight some of them, but don't you think that there's one other reason is also a question of decision process? Because the part of these policies are not really well defined with local populations, especially in rural or urban areas, and they do not, so people are not concerned, and they are not involved in the decision process in the end. And so part of this policy, as you stated, are directed as we'll say, oh, now we need to have our technopole or our cluster, and this will be great because in other region it has been done, but in the end, that's nothing because people are not involved on that, and in the end, if they can vote with their feet or something like this.
Andre, that's a great question, and I think you answered my question with your, and that is you're exactly right. That one of the reasons why we get, whether it's a rural area or an urban area, ineffective policy is that all the stakeholders are not consulted. A large share of the stakeholders don't believe, just don't even care. It's not even going to affect me. Why should I even care or participate? And thus we get policies that too often go to a few elite. They might benefit, but don't have widespread effect. So a key challenge, which is one of the challenges that people at this conference have been wrestling with, is how do we get widespread participation in the governance process so that we can be more effectively, we can more realistically expect that policy will have beneficial effects instead of just helping a handful of elites, the people who would own the cluster or own the business in the cluster instead of people we were hoping would actually benefit.
Yeah, Mark, I have two points. The first one, you define, say, an optimal or better rural strategy or rural development strategy, and we agree with you that one thinking is not a good thing, okay? But in our framework, how are you sure that we do not have one thinking in your framework, in the rural policy, in fact? We can exactly have the same thing. And the second point is, I am not sure to understand if you recommend to subsidize jobs in rural areas or services in rural areas.
Let me take the second question first. First off, that's a great question, and I think it really gets at good rural development strategy and good rural development research, is that in some areas, it is most effective to have good services so that you draw a population there who may commute to other areas, who may do all sorts, this will attract tourists to the areas, who basically very rural urban kind of development. If you attract the people may not work there, but they want to live there. Versus other areas where it's most effective to have some sort of job creation because you need the jobs there. So it's less about having a nice place, it's more about the jobs. And so one of the key things of good rural development policy is recognizing in some places it's about job creation, in other places it's about quality of life and attracting the people, and perhaps economic opportunity will follow. So I think you really hit that it depends. And that's one of the reasons why government agencies and ministries need the capacity to conduct policy so they can understand what places may be different. Then getting at your first question was, just remind me.
Okay, what do you do to be sure that at the end, if we implement your policy, we do not have one thinking And I do not see why.
I will say, okay, first, no, I think you shouldn't see why. Because all I was able to, I think, show or asserted that if you read my papers and you believe my papers, you believe the statistics, let's say all I really showed you is that geographically targeted policy, if it's successful, can work. I didn't necessarily show you in all cases when it could work, and I acknowledge that I've only been able to talk about ways to avoiding the problems of geographically targeted policy, and we still could have bad geographically targeted policy. So I completely agree with that. All I was able to show is that it might work if we did it well, but I've only talked about a framework of trying to get it right, not necessarily I got it right.
You describe the share between agricultural and non-agricultural employment in rural US. Could you tell us a little more about which kind of sector are present in non-agricultural employment? Are they manufacturing sector or business services or population services in the US?
In the okay, what does rural America look like? Okay, outside of, with the caveat, the warning that rural America is very heterogeneous. So when I'm describing an average, and that is, it's of course a little bit more primary sector. But if you look at the shares, it's not all that different than urban America. That's one of the things is rural America doesn't look all that different than urban America in economic activity. A little bit less finance, a little bit more manufacturing because it's less expensive, a little bit more in the lower levels of services and less in the higher levels of services, but still very similar shares in the services, maybe a little bit higher in government, public employment because you're providing public services to a more sparse population. But all in all, rural America's industry composition is not that different today. Where in 1950 it was remarkably different. So it's more like urban America.
Yes, among the points that you mentioned, I understood that you highlighted very much the fact that the rural areas are very heterogeneous, and that at the same time it's very important to account for the interactions between different areas. So I understand that there is a need for tools then to fine-tune policies accounting for this heterogeneity, which is also very much evolving in time. So what kind of tools do you imagine or have you considered to account for this heterogeneity in time and to adapt maybe the policies according to this evolution?
Well, let me describe one and only one approach. Don't think I just described every research approach here, but let me just give you a feel for how an economist views that question, okay? Economists, we like to run our statistical models. We love our statistical models. And we have all sorts of statistical techniques to look at spillovers across regions. Bertrand has actually pioneered some of those about a little over 10 years ago for France. So we have that. So we could get reasonable ideas of what our average is. But I think what's more interesting is not the average, it's how places are different than the average, the heterogeneity. And in that sense, once we know a place is different than the average, that's where sociologists and geographers are better placed than, say, economists are at going in and looking at some of the case studies, why places are different than what we would have expected them to be. What the economist thinks the average place would have looked like, why are these places a little bit different? And then doing case study work then to help fine-tune the kinds of policies, especially for most places that are actually different than what we would have expected. So I see a combination of both economists doing what we do well is finding general patterns, and say sociologists and geographers and other social sciences are very good at discovering why something is different.
Okay, I think it's time to break. and for lunch. I would like thank you very much, Mark, for the quality of your conference and for the debate. Thanks very much.
Thank you.